One day in October of last year, I was sitting at my desk doing things I thought were probably very important that day when I received a call from a coworker, and she said, "Daniel, have you been on Facebook today?" I'm like, "No, I'm working on this." She said, "Go right now, look at Andrew's page." So I went there, and as I was doing it, I was worried because here we are in the middle of the day, and I had to stop my work. I was running against some kind of deadline, like we always do. And I start thinking to myself, oh my God, has he said something on Facebook that maybe rubbed somebody the wrong way? Because Andrew was a very passionate guy, working in public education, defending children, calling people out for policies that are not great. Maybe he said something that wasn't nice, and perhaps we had to have some sort of HR conversation, which is never fun, right? To my surprise, when I get there, I read a post by him, and what he has written on the post was a goodbye note, where he lists people who have been kind to him. He thanks them for all the love they've given him, but that he was checking out. He was tired of life, and he was going to commit suicide. And in fact, so much thought had gone into it that he also left a playlist of songs he wished were played at his funeral. It was such a shock that I had to read the message again to make sure I truly understood what I was reading. Because Andrew was a great guy, always helpful, who had given no indication whatsoever that he was struggling with anything. In fact, he oftentimes was the person people would go to when they had problems. And on that day, the message came as a kick in the gut. I immediately called other folks and said, "Have you heard from Andre?" After having tried to call him and he wasn't picking up his phone. And they said, "No, I have not." Some had been told, some were also unaware of what's going on, and we asked everybody to start calling him, as we had also noticed that a lot of his friends on Facebook was also reaching out to him via messages and text messages, hundreds of them. But 20 minutes had passed, and we were very worried. Because I was an employee of our organization, I tried calling the police and the phone service company to see if we could locate his phone. And our hopes were that if we located him, we could get the police to get there in time. Because we didn't know where he was. He wasn't home. He wasn't at work. But understandably, the phone company could not give us his location without a court order. So what we did then was to start texting him. And one thing that we could see, that I could notice in the moment, is that he was reading text messages. And sometimes your iPhone says read. And that brought us a little bit of hope, and we told friends on our team to continue to text him and call. Eventually, he replied back to one of our coworkers who talked to him, was able to kind of surmise the location of where he was, which was a different city altogether. We already had our legal team and other folks talking to the police, and they were able to get there in time and prevent him from taking his own life. That was an incredible day. Andre was taken. He got the help that he needed, spent some time at the hospital, and a week later, as he left the hospital, resumed his life. That moment was an incredible moment for all of us because it affected us dearly. We weren't expecting that. There were no indications. We all questioned ourselves. Could we have seen this? Should we have seen this? What is it that we missed? How can it be that this incredible person decides to check out like that? But the story does not end there. Because about a month later, Andre tried it again. This time we heard it after the fact. But somebody was also able to go into his house, and before he had asphyxiated, the paramedics got there and saved him one more time. And again, he was taken to a hospital where he received proper treatment. The good news is that after that second attempt, he told us that he was feeling a lot better now because he's actually taking the medications that were prescribed to him the first time around. First he didn't think he needed it. The second time when he started taking the medication, he felt a lot clearer about the things were going. So we felt reassured, but we are also very taken by all this. And right before Christmas, we heard that he was attempting for the third time within a span of 3 months. And we just didn't know what to do. Fortunately, he was able to walk himself out of that one. He himself decided this time that he was not going to do it, to which we were really helpful. But the ghost of all these attempts, somebody that we care about and works with us, don't go away that quickly. They stay with you. And every time I see a Facebook posting from Andrew, I can tell you something in these 2 words. Why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this to illustrate that suicide, or the desire for suicide, doesn't happen to other people. To people that we don't know, that we have no knowledge of, or who are mentally ill. These are everyday occurrences that rock one's lives and the lives of everyone around them, to a point that it has become an epidemic in our world today. So what we hope to do in the next 45 minutes or so is to talk about suicide from a spiritual perspective. And if anything else, we want to raise the question and the doubt in your mind, if you ever thought about it, or in the mind of anybody who might be thinking about it, that death is not the end. Because you see, people who are going to the trials of life and have such deep pain, they are not seeking to end their lives, kill themselves. What they really want, they tell us, is to stop their suffering. And they just believe that if they take their lives, their suffering will end, because then you will be gone. Everything will be gone. But what if death is not the end? But what if that thinking is flawed? What if life goes on after this world? Maybe that will lead us to rethink this approach. So what we want to do today is instill in you this doubt that life ends with the death of the physical body. Because we know that it's not true. But not everybody does. And so we want to share in the next couple of minutes some of the questionings and lines of thought that lead us to believe that life goes on. And try to address some of the challenges and the myths, frankly, about suicide. Because it's something that is happening so often that it's hard for us not to eventually come in contact with. Now let's start then by sharing a little bit about the magnitude of the problem, so you have a sense that this is really widespread. So the problem itself, right, it's a big one. 42,773 is the number of people in this country last year who died by suicide. 42,000 is enough to fill the stadium. So let me put that in perspective. That makes it perhaps easier for you to understand. 5 people every hour in this country take their lives. That is equivalent to say, by the time that we're done talking here today, a whole row of people will have ended their lives and affected the lives of those who they're related to. Look around. It's not faceless people. These are people's lives, jobs, wives, kids, who are struggling so much that they decided that they need to check out. If we look deeper though, it gets worse because these rates are increasing. It's only normal that the number of suicides, if you think about it from a data perspective, will increase over time because population increases, right? So it's normal that the number itself will increase. But what the experts do is they come up with a ratio, or a rate, and they say, what are the numbers of suicides that are happening by 100,000 people, so that you can compare progress over time and from country to country. And the numbers are alarming because you can see here that since 2005, this line is steadily increasing, which means proportionally there are more people dying by suicide in our country. It's the 10th highest cause of death in the US today. And if you look at some age ranges, like from 15 to 35 males, it is, if not the first, the second or third cause of death. It's serious, people. It gets uglier. There are 25 attempts per suicide. So if we talk about 5 people dying by suicide in 1 hour, imagine there will be 125 people trying during the same amount of time. It's more than all of us here. Double. Serious business that we don't see and we don't talk about because of a stigma. Right? But what could lead someone to such an extent of pain that they think that their only solution is to end their lives? It has to be an incredible amount of pain and doubt and uncertainty for us to get there. We cannot just brush this aside. It's not a simple, I'm not feeling well today. It is some deep pain. So what we want to do is look into the causes of this potentially and offer some tools from a spiritual perspective that we think may lead us to better understand that really death is not the end, or at least raise the question in our minds to prevent people from finding a permanent solution to a temporary problem. And I promise, it will get more uplifting. But does that make sense? Mm-hmm. We might not be presenting anything new here to you, but we want to point you and give you some furnishings and some stuffing of things that you can resort to if people are ever approaching you, or if you ever feel like you might be considering this. Because from our experience as Spiritists who are in constant contact with the spiritual world, after all, as we said before, Spiritism comes from the very interaction between worlds. We know for a fact that life goes on. In fact, it's not uncommon for us in our Spiritist mediumistic meetings to talk to those who have taken their own lives and who show a great deal of regret for their actions. And while we do not want to blame or point fingers, that's not what we're here for, we do hear cautionary tales from them telling us, tell other people that life goes on. And even if you don't believe in that, which is totally okay, we want to kind of go through the gamut of opportunities for us to realize why we're here in this earth, the life goes on. But it would be naive of us to just give those facts without going to the causes. Because there are two causes, I feel like, for us to arrive at this kind of behavior. One is an emotional feeling, right? And one is intellectual. Well, why is it that we feel like we hit a wall and we need to check out? People arrive at this for different reasons. Sometimes they reason it out and find that it is the best solution for them, to the point that they plan it. To such a degree, as Andrew did, of leaving a playlist of songs he would like played at his funeral. It's not an impulsive act for that person. It was a well thought out solution to a problem that was not finding its natural resolution. But at the same time, there are also cases of impulsive decisions where people reach a conclusion quickly and act very quickly without reasoning very much. So we want to look at both the intellective causes and the emotional causes and suggest some things that we want to look at. Right? To talk about that, we need to talk about pain and suffering. Because if suicide is an attempt to escape and evade this suffering, we've got to address it. Just saying, don't do it, it's not good enough. Things will get better. It's nice. But it may not be enough for some. So how can we start to understand pain and suffering in a way that will give us some sort of framework to make actionable change in our minds and in our hearts? And to that, if you allow us, we're going to resort to one of the great psychologists of all times, in my opinion, Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha. And I want to tell you a little story, probably around 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. And it's a story of the Prince Siddhartha as he leaves the palace for the first time. You see, Siddhartha was a prince for a very, very rich king that loved his son so much, as many of us parents do, decided to protect his son, so the legend goes, as much as he could. So he kept his son within the palace and provided his son with everything he needed. But when Siddhartha was 18 years of age, he wanted to leave the palace and see the world for the first time. Eventually, after much debate, his father lets him take the trip, and here he is depicted in this painting taking this trip with his friend there who is driving him around. And as they are going into that, Siddhartha eventually arrives at his Four Noble Truths. But what's interesting about, before we even go there, what's interesting about his trip is that he sees four signs, according to the Buddhist folklore. And as he's walking around, you can't see him very well, but right back there at the back, you see all the way back there, he sees an old man. And he asks his friends, "What's that?" And his friend says, "It's an old man, reaching the end of his days." And he takes that in. He had never seen an old person before. Then the second sign, he moves a little bit forward and he sees a sick person. And he asks his friend again, "What's that?" And his friend tells him it's a sick person who's struggling with their health. And Siddhartha had never seen them again, and he's taken by it. Sheltered by his life, by his father in his life. He'd never been exposed to that. And then he comes across a third sign. He sees a dead body. And he asks his friends, "What's that?" And he says, "That is the body of a dead man." And again, Siddhartha is shocked by that. And as his thinking continues to go on, Siddhartha sees his fourth sign. He sees a monk meditating, and he has very little on him, barely a bowl of rice. But as he's meditating with nothing but some clothes and some food, Siddhartha noticed a smile. And then he thinks that through contemplation and meditation, he can arrive the meaning of life. That's when he comes up with his Four Noble Truths, which are a beautiful treatise on psychology and understanding suffering. And that's why we bring it forward to you, because I am fascinated by it. I think it's genius. The first learning that Siddhartha tells us in his Noble Truths is that life is dukkha. And dukkha is a word for pain and suffering. But suffering, not a physical suffering, but that suffering that you have from not having your needs satisfied. You know, when you want something but you don't get it. So he says that life is that. It's the suffering that comes from not being fulfilled. That there is trials and there's struggles. And that's the certainty of it. This world is full of this. I think we can agree with that. But here comes the genius thing. He says, the dukkha, the suffering, comes from attachment to impermanent things. It's simple, but it's beautiful. That is to say, if you are attaching your happiness to something that will change, when that thing changes, you will be disappointed and you will suffer. See the genius of this? So if you are placing all your eggs in the basket of love and happiness by way of fulfillment with things that will change, you are sure to be let down. If happiness for you is having a new car or a new house, eventually that car will break down. And eventually that house will no longer be new or will crumble. And because they changed, and they're no longer those expectations you have, you will suffer. Isn't that genius? And so he goes on to say that if we are able to eliminate this attachment to impermanent things, we will enter a state of bliss, of happiness. If we stop loving impermanent things, we will feel good. And the way to do that comes from a specific behavioral conduct we call the Eightfold Path, which we won't talk here, but thinking the right things, saying the right things, doing the right things is a way of being to address that. And I think it's a genius message that later will be improved on and complemented by the greatest soul ever to grace this planet, Jesus the Christ, when he, in complete accordance with what Buddha says, completes that message by saying, gather treasures in heaven, where it does not rust, and where moths do not corrupt it. If Buddha said, don't attach your happiness to impermanent things because they will change, Jesus agrees, as often is the case with the great spiritual messengers, always in unison, and points us even further, saying, instead, attach your happiness to permanent things. And what are permanent things? Things of the spirit. Qualities and things that will never change. Because if that is your goal, then your satisfaction will not fade away. And I make a stop here because sometimes we think the relationships and people are permanent things. But they're not. Because the people around us will also fade away in this lifetime. So we cannot put our happiness on other people. Because they too may change their minds, may pass away, may move, and we will suffer. So our happiness has to be an individual pursuit about meaning from a spiritual perspective that nourishes our soul. If we arrive at that, then we're more likely than not to not face great dukkha, suffering and dissatisfaction, and therefore pain. So it's no surprise that if all that we are attaching our happiness to is the impermanent world, the world outside of us, that we can be very let down by everything that's happening. Things are constantly changing, and they may seem not like good things at all. So why do we bring this up? We bring this up because at the root of all this is our understanding that pain and suffering comes from this dissatisfaction that can only really be addressed when we think spiritually. You only really get to be fulfilled long term when you place attention to spiritual skills, abilities, and qualities. When you develop kindness, love, and all these things that you take away with yourself and that somebody can never take away from you. Right? So with that in mind, can we provide solutions that are both intellectual in nature and emotional, to hint at the fact that these things that we talk about, these spiritual things that we talk about, they're real. They're not just frou-frou things that are out there or that New Agey people meditate and talk about. And there's nice. Are there ways for us to really answer the question that death is not the end? So we want to talk about the intellectual perspective of that and then the emotional perspective of that, if that makes sense. Right? So let's dive into the intellectual piece. Because what we really want to do here is elicit the question, what if there is no death? Right? Because if there is no death, then you cannot end your suffering by taking your own life. We have to deal with it somehow else. And what are the things that might lead us to believe that there is no death? Well, there's 6 areas here that present evidence of life after life or before life. Depends on how you want to look at it. Mediumship, spontaneous memories of past lives, memory regression, near-death experiences, and instrumental transcommunication. If we find solace in any of those areas, find evidence that may lead us to believe that life goes on, then we have a strong argument to understand that there is no death. Hence, taking one's own lives is not a good solution to inner pain. That make sense? All right, so let's dive into the stuff quickly. And of course, we're not going to go at length to this. We want to give you like a little buffet, right? A little smattering, a little taste of different things, and point you to some ways that you can get more information if you're interested in that area. After all, our time is short, and to be honest with you, I'm not an expert on all these things. But I want to point you to people who are, right? Who can get there. You ready? All right, so let's start with what we know really well, mediumship from a Spiritist perspective. We talked about this briefly here, but one of the things that we're uniquely equipped to talk about in Spiritism is mediumship and the interaction with the spiritual realm, because that's how Spiritism came about, and it's, in many ways that is the core of Spiritism, because everything we do has to do with the spirit and the interaction between worlds. So anywhere in the world today, there are probably a dozen of Spiritist mediumship meetings taking place that corroborate all that we're talking about, right? This is not something that happens in one place. This is something that happens often and in many different places, done by many different people who do not know each other, obtain the same results that lead us to believe that, for us Spiritists, life after life is a reality, right? And so if you want to learn more about that and how we undertake this process, we have wonderful books that you can read into. You're probably familiar with it, the Spirit's book, and of course the Medium's book, which is the first treatise on how to communicate with the spiritual world from a scientific perspective that was ever written. Right? These are fascinating books, but they're not easy reads. They're not always exciting reads because they are not necessarily meant to entertain. They're meant to educate, and it requires a little bit of effort. So as I say repeatedly, I've never met anybody who says, I'm sorry, I'm not going to go out to the movies with you this Friday because I'm going to stay home reading the Spirit's book or the Medium's book. It doesn't happen, right? It just kind of doesn't happen. It's okay if it does, but I mean, it's not common because they are reference books. They're books that you need to kind of put your time and effort into, right? But then you can say, but then clearly you're biased, you're a Spiritist, duh. Yes, that is correct. So that's why we also want to shift gears and present some research on mediumship that is not Spiritist. Because mediumship is not property of Spiritism. Mediumship has always existed throughout history. We just did not know it by that name because the name medium and mediumship were coined by Allan Kardec. So you're not going to find these terms before the 1850s when the Spiritist book was first published, right? You're going to find other terms. You're going to find prophets, shamans, oracles, right? A bunch of different things, right? So that you need to look for those terms. So if you find the term medium in a publication that's older than 1850s, it's interesting. Somebody added it after the fact, right? So just a perspective there. But in terms of research, there has been historical research on this that is abundant in many different ways. We'll share with you some here, right? And so if you look over here, and this set of fine gentlemen with a fair amount of body hair, face hair, which I'm jealous of somewhat. And so here we have Conan Doyle, the author of Sherlock Holmes, who part of his life later on was actually dedicated to spiritualism and spiritualist research. He stopped writing Sherlock Holmes and cared about this, especially after he lost a son during the First World War. And over here is an Italian investigator called Cesare Lombroso that carried out a series of investigations as well. So if you're interested, you can read his work. And down here we have Gabriel Delanne, a French investigator as well, that later became Spiritist, but it's also interesting in the actual phenomena. If you want more folks, over here we have William Crookes, a famous scientist in England that was part of the Royal Academy of Science, so very well established individual, who in fact later in his life wrote a letter to the Academy saying that this phenomena were indeed true, taking great risk to his career, but he was established anyways. And here, in fact, if you look at it, you see a picture of him, and you see that lovely lady over there. Well, that's not a medium, that's actually a spirit, materialized spirit. That's a rare kind of pictures, but an interesting picture anyways, because back in the day, we didn't have Photoshop. So it was a lot more evidence than it is today. Today we live in an age of skepticism, right? Skepticism in general, we don't believe things, we think everything was edited. Well, this one back in the day, when people saw this picture, wasn't, because they couldn't edit it back. And on the side there, you have a medium, D.D. Humestoon, a great Scottish medium that has a lot of stuff that was done to him. And of course, French investigator Charles Richet. On the left, on the right side, we have the Russian Alexander Aksakov. And down here, we have the medium Esapia Palladino, who was also the subject of many studies. We could talk more about those. They're really interesting to hear about those people in general. But you can also say, but then these people are old, right? These are like ancient thinking people. I even heard about them before. Is there anybody more modern? Yes, there is. There's some research that still happens, and this man over here is a great guy, Dr. Gary Schwartz. He's at the University of Arizona. So he's actually in an institution of research, and he carries out experiments to validate mediumship to this day. And he has a very simple book to read for those of us who might not have an academic background called The Afterlight Experiments, and in it he narrates his experiences investigating whether mediumship communications and double-blind studies and other kind of fun stuff were actually effective or not, right, in obtaining information that would be considered otherworldly. And he carried out some research to famous mediums, Alison Dubois and John Edward, for instance, as well. Alison Dubois is the medium that inspired that TV series Medium a while back. So if you want to know more about mediumship, then you can kind of look into all these places to find some evidence. There are others. But the concept here, as you can understand, is easy. If there are indeed spirits, and you're communicating with spirits, then they're telling us that life continues after the physical body. So it's a proof of the fact that we don't end with our physical body, that there is no death. Right? So that's why you want to study that. You still with me? We're going to run quickly. Put your seatbelts on. We're going to rush through this. Hope you don't have motion sickness. All right. One of my favorites is cases of spontaneous memories. And these are people who just randomly recall past experiences, which turn out to be past lives, which at first they don't understand. And you say, what? Does this happen? Yes, actually it does. And there's actually people who investigate that, such as this man, Dr. Ian Stevenson, right over here. A very interesting man, very dedicated, passed away in 2007, or was it 11? 2007. And he did academic research out of the University of Virginia about spontaneous memories and published some academic books, including this one, 20 Cases Suggestive of Reincarnation, which is a milestone really in the field because it's backed by a research university. It's one of those books that is not an easy read because it's more of a, a research paper kind of thing. But in it, he brings out 20 cases that he says are suggestive of reincarnation. What's fascinating about him, I think, besides the fact that he documented more than 3,000 cases in his 40 years of research, is that he was particularly keen to investigate cases of spontaneous memories in children. Because children were less likely to put up filters of deceit, right? And they weren't able to create elaborate stories that would hold scrutiny over time. So he was particularly interested in talking to children because if they were lying or trying to manufacture something, it can be more easily caught, especially really young kids at tender ages. And he found some fascinating cases of, especially with kids who had birthmarks in their current body that related to the cause of death in previous lives. So they would recollect being shot in the heart, and this time, when little, they had a little birthmark on that specific place. It doesn't mean it happens all the time. We understand that in Spiritism, but in some cases, the shock was so great that it carried a physical piece to it. And it's fascinating because what he and his team did was they would go to these remote areas often, hear these stories, and go find out if these stories were really true. And oftentimes, these stories would take them to other countries or other places far away that those families had no connection to or means to investigate and create. So it's fascinating stuff. I'm fascinated by his study. I think it's amazing. And it's a proof, again, that a soul inhabited a body before and then came back and is inhabiting another body. Right? So if you're interested, there's a suggestion. And another along those lines is Carol Bauman, and she wrote this book called Children's Past Lives in 1997. And what she does for us is she makes a lot of his research easy to read. She tells us some of her stories that she investigated, but she also makes it easier for us to understand that academic language. And her interest started when she experienced that with one of her children, who actually had spontaneous memories. And so she started to go after that, and that's how she arrived at Dr. Ian Stevenson, and how she started working with past life regression, and so forth. So it's a really interesting read, fascinating as well. I had a pleasure of meeting her, as I had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Schwartz in the previous Spiritist Symposium. Great people to talk to, and it's just wonderful to see that the kind of research still goes on and still provides proof for people who are willing to look for it, that indeed the life that we know of does not end with the death of the physical life. Right? Now, shifting gears to a different kind of case, we talked about spontaneous memories when they just kind of surface on their own. There's also the case of memory regression, and one of the great exponents of this that became mainstream and known by many people is Dr. Brian Weiss, that published a book called Many Lives and Many Masters in 1988. And in that book, he tells us some cases, some accounts, when he was actually working on memory regression to try to find the trauma that these people exhibited. And he was trying to regress them to an earlier part of their life, like childhood, to memories that they may not remember. But oops, all of a sudden, they regressed too much. And were telling him of stories of lives before, which might have been quite a shock for Dr. Brian Weiss at first, if you think about it, right? But if you're interested about that, then you have his books, and the idea here again, it's simple. If you are remembering lives that you lived before, then you must have lived before, which means death is not the end of us, right? So, great book, Many Lives, Many Masters, and then you have Same Soul, Many Bodies, another one, and out of Miami, Florida, Dr. Brian Weiss, pretty famous exponent in the area of memory regression. With me so far? But for the price of one, you get 2 examples of memory regression. I also want to talk to you about Dr. Michael Newton, that published the book Journey of Souls. The idea here is similar to Dr. Brian Weiss. The interesting thing is that Dr. Michael Newton's patients, when they were led into regression, remembered not just past lives, but remember the in-between of lives, when they were bodiless, right? When they didn't have a physical body. So that's another proof of the fact that the soul indeed exists outside of the physical body and does not need the physical body to exist, because if they are in between lives, then clearly they don't have a body, right? So if you're interested about it, Journey of Souls and Destiny of Souls, some cases there, I think they're always fascinating to read. They're easy reads too, right? So Dr. Michael Newton is another possibility there. We shift gears one more time to Dr. Moody and Dr. Kubler-Ross, right and left, and talk about near-death experiences, which was a term coined by Dr. Moody himself that basically described the experiences one has while clinically dead. So if you're clinically dead, how can you have perceptions and memories and recalls, right? So his research goes around that, and some of them are really interesting because there are patients who recall conversations that were taking place a couple of rooms removed from where their body laid at the surgery table, right? Because you can make an argument, for instance, that yes, maybe they didn't really die, maybe they were still there, so it would only be normal for them to realize what was happening around their body while they were in coma, whatever it is. But it becomes a little bit harder to explain sometimes how people can recall conversations in rooms that they were not in when they were clinically dead, right? So if you want to read more about that, you have some of his books, Life After Life, here, and Dr. Kubler-Ross as well did a lot of writing and working on death and dying in general. So she's a fascinating character as well, and we'll talk about her a little bit later on. But this idea that we can have experiences when we're clinically dead and then come back to our physical body and share these experiences we had while we technically were not alive anymore. It's a fascinating one for some folks, and so you might want to look at that as well if you want further proof that the soul lives on after the physical body. All right? And that brings us to instrumental transcommunication. I gotta be honest with you, not my favorite. But in the interest of putting it out there, you decide whether you're interested or not. And this is sometimes also referred to EVP, electronic voice phenomena, and there have been Hollywood movies, horror movies about this kind of stuff. But the idea here is simple. You place a recording device in a location with no people, and you then listen back to it and find recordings of voices. Right? Does not require specialized equipment. And if you want to know more, you can read about it. There's a great book called There Is No Death and There Are No Dead by Tom and Lisa Butler from the American Association for Electronic Voice Phenomena. It's this book over here. But you can also look for the work of Dr. Konstantin Rodiv, who's Latvian and works out of the university in Sweden, in Uppsala, Sweden. And along with Dr. Jurgensen over there, they've recorded more than 100,000 EVP sessions. So it's quite an interesting perspective too, to try to grab proof that life outlives the physical body, right? Because of course, again, if you are hearing people talk in a room where there's no people who are quote quote alive, then the soul continues to live outside the physical body. Ready? Good? Are you feeling good? Okay. But because you've been such awesome customers, I also want to give you with a 7 opportunity to think about reasons that might lead us to believe that the life really indeed goes on. This is more of a thought experience, but if you believe in God, and this only holds true if you believe in God. So if you don't believe in God, if people don't believe in God, then you don't need to go that route, right? But if you do believe in God, then we must be led to the idea of reincarnation eventually. Because it's the only way that we are going to be able to explain why we have congenital disorders, why we have a different level of abilities early on, like, with child prodigies and so forth, why people are born in families that are very different from each other, right? Because it wouldn't be fair for all of us, if we only have one life, to start at such vast different places, and then be judged by what we've done in those places, and receive future punishment or grace depending on a very short amount of time. It just doesn't make sense to me. That we can have a God that's loving and kind and say, you get to live in a family that has means and loves you, and you will live at 80, up to the right age of 85 years of age. You, however, will be born in a family that doesn't really care that much for you, doesn't have a lot of means, and guess what? You're only going to live 3 years, until 3 years old. So how do you judge all of that if it's just to one life. Right? So when we rub against the concept of God, we must necessarily understand that there's got to be more lives. Even if you forget about all the spiritual mediumship and everything else, we must arrive there intellectually, because otherwise God would not be fair. And if God is not fair, then God is not God. Right? But God's my neighbor who judges me. Right? So God must be caring and loving. And so when we begin to look at the idea of God and reincarnation, which come together hand in hand when you really start thinking about it, you also understand that if you can't find a cause for all these differences in this lifetime, they must have come from a previous lifetime. Because everything in nature is cause and consequence. If there's an effect, if something is like this today, and you can't find a cause for it here, then it must be before. Which is the very same thinking that led Dr. Brian Wise and Dr. Michael Newton to try to go into memory regression to find the causes of these things, right? They were trying to find in their way the causes for trauma in this life, and they ended up happening to find out that it was in other lives, right? But that's just a thought experience. I'm just going to throw that out there as a bonus. If you call the next 20 minutes, right? Like every good infomercial you also get. But you get the idea. So there's lots of things there from an intellectual perspective that if you really want to search for this, and the key is you have to want to, right? There is, I think, powerful evidence for those who might be incredulous as to the existence of the soul or the fact that the soul outlives the physical body that can be found. And those are 6 different areas there with an extra 7 for thought experiments if you really want to. That addresses a little bit of the intellectual component. But addressing the intellectual component is not enough. We must also talk about our emotional component, because the truth is, we are emotional beings. We're not yet reasonable and rational beings. Our emotions still drive our thinking more than the other way around. Right? And so we need to address these emotions. The problem is, we haven't had the education. Socially speaking, as a society, we have not been told very much how to deal with our emotions. Think about it. We go to school, and in school, we learn things of the mind. And all we're told is how to learn and do things or memorize things, although that's changing, right? But that pertain to emotion. We're not really taught how to deal with conflict, how to share our feelings. All of that is left down to our personal experiences, generally with our families. Right? So we model, we copy that which our family did, because that's the environment we created in, and that's all the emotional education we have. So it's no surprise that we kind of suck at this emotion thing, because we're getting 0 training, and when we're lucky, we get some at home. But how are we going to get that at home if our parents didn't have it? You see the challenge here? We cannot really blame our parents for our emotional stunted growth, because they had less emotional training than we did. They lived in an era where talking about their emotions was even harder and less accepted than it is today. So the whole idea of, that we have today, which are things that we're finding to break down, that boys don't cry, that you can't hug, or that you shouldn't, all of these challenges that we have are legacies of these past generations that weren't necessarily great emotional teachers. We can't blame them because they didn't have it. They were also doing their best. I don't know one parent that wakes up in the morning and says, today I'm going to screw it up for my kid. Right? You might screw it up as your parent royally, but you don't do that really. Right? So, where is our emotional education? We need to talk about this. Because we're all struggling with this. We all struggle, and that's the big fallacy about this thing. We think that only people who have problems have mental illnesses. Isn't it funny that when somebody breaks a leg and is put in a cast, we have fun with it and we even sign their casts, we ask them how they're doing, we talk about it, we have designer casts these days, so you can like put colors and things, right? And it's okay. But when we're feeling blue, it's not okay to talk about it. And if somebody talks about it, we don't know how to handle it, so we ostracize them a little bit. Isn't that weird? So it's okay to talk about broken parts of our body, which is less important than our emotions, but it's not okay to deal with emotions. What a stigma. So we've got to be able to talk about this. And that's why we bring back Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. She has a genius saying here, which I love. She says, I'm not okay. You're not okay. And that's okay. Right? It's silly, but it's true. Like, hey, let's just fess up to the fact that all of us struggle with feelings and emotions in points of our lives. But the great mystery here is that we think that nobody else does. We think we are the only ones who are struggling with that. And we perpetuate this myth by telling people everything is okay. It's a new kind of political correctness. You can't say to people, or at least we feel we can't say to people that we've had a tough day or a tough couple of months. It's not acceptable. We've got to break this stigma. If you go to Facebook, all you see is people having wonderful lives. It's amazing how wonderful people are. I seldom see people saying, I've had a really tough day and I could use a call right now. Can somebody call me? I'm feeling low. Have you seen that on Facebook?
Never.
I haven't. We're so insecure, we're so stigmatized that we feel we've got to put our best foot forward. So all we find is wonderful pictures of things, to the extent that selfies have become an art form, right? People go out there and take pictures of themselves in their best possible light and then put it out in the world, because the idea here is simple, even though unconscious, is look, everybody, how great I am. We all do it. It's okay. I'm just analyzing it a little bit, right? I'm not saying you're a master selfie taker, but I'm saying we all have a need for external validation to fill the void that we all feel but we don't talk about. And if we don't talk about it, how the hell are we going to solve it? People hope it go away. That's been the technique of our parents. Shove your feelings deep down inside where no one can find it and hope that it goes away. That's what we do. But they don't. They stay in there. And if we don't deal with that, and if we don't exercise that emotional muscle, like going to the gym, we go to the gym to make our bodies look nicer, but we don't go to the emotional gym to make our emotions alive. So, what's wrong to talking to a psychologist or psychiatrist? In our society, there's still stigma to it. Our parents, that's like, only crazy people do that. I would argue that only crazy people don't do that. Right? Because people who are certifiably crazy generally think that they need no help. They think other people are crazy. Which actually might be true, if you think about it from perspective. Right? So we need to talk about this. And this emotional education is something that we ought to change in our society. So if you are a parent, you need to talk to your kids about your feelings. And it's hard to do that. And if you're not a parent, you need to talk to people about your feelings. Right? And there are no bad feelings. They're just feelings. How we deal with that is what's going to make a difference. Right? And of course our time is running short in general, and there's so many things we can talk about. But here are some tools of the trade that are not spiritist by nature, but might help you talk about and deal with conflict and emotions in your life. One of them is the ruler framework by this guy that I also had a pleasure of meeting in a conference, Mark Brackett from the Yale Center of Emotional Intelligence, and he has a ruler method that gives you specific steps, like, you first need to recognize emotions before you can really address them. So that's the R for ruler, and so forth and so forth. So if you want more information, search online. It's fascinating guy, great method in general. And if you're also looking for a tool on how to communicate with people and feel and address these needs and conflicts that we have, I suggest Marshall Rosenberg's nonviolent communication, also referred to as NVC, nonviolent communication, sometimes also referred as compassionate communication. It's a technique for dialoguing and talking to people so that we can overcome conflicts in a way that's not personal and has both people in mind. It's fascinating. It's fantastic. Non-Spiritist tools, of course, there's mindfulness, meditation, so forth, but Spiritism values all these approaches because it tells us that life goes on and we must address them. But the good spirits in Spiritism are not going to prescribe a specific way because they know that each person may need a different approach.
Would you share this with us? Well, I know it's
yes. Of course, I'd be glad to. So you can kind of investigate. It's very fascinating stuff. I mean, there's some really smart people doing great work out there that blows your socks off if you wear socks. Guys, it's been so cold in California these days, on the winter. I had to put socks on last week. I know you're feeling my pain. You're empathizing. So there's an emotional component to this that we must address as well, in addition to the intellectual piece. And you can say, but Dan, what does Spiritism have to do? How can Spiritism help with all this stuff? Well, I hope you've gotten a hint. Spiritism is a dynamic body of knowledge that studies the nature, origin, and destiny of spirits, as well as their relationship to the physical world. That's one of the definitions that Allan Kardec himself, the compiler of Spiritism, gave to Spiritism as he was writing the little books called What is Spiritism? I changed the word science to body of knowledge here because the word science nowadays is understood a little bit different in this country than it was before, but you get the drift here. Is we continue to amass knowledge to study the nature, origin, and destiny of who we are truly, spirits, not physical people. We're not a body that has a spirit. We're a spirit who temporarily has a body, but we think the other way. So that messes it all up, right? So what we study in Spiritism is the good old questions of, truly, what are we? We're spirits. Where do we come from? And where are we going? There cannot be more fundamental questions in life than all of that, right? And of course, we also study how spirits relates to the physical world. How does the spiritual world relate to the physical world? Hint, hint, mediumship. How does that take place? That's why we're so interested about the interaction of spirits, because we think it's key for us understanding who we truly are, where we're coming, where we're going to, right, and what's going to happen to us. So it's only natural that we think about all these things, and when we look at those causes for pain and suffering, the walls that we hit intellectually or emotionally, Spiritism is very well equipped, I feel, to address them because of this. For instance, this is from the Spirit's book, part 917. Kardec writes, when it's rightly understood, education will be the key to moral progress. So if we can educate ourselves properly, we can change ourselves morally. Not the education we receive in schools, that's instruction, right? But the true education of the soul. And he goes farther on to say this. He says, when the art of managing characters, right, your own character, is as well understood as the art of managing intelligences, we will be able to correct characters in the same way that we straighten new plants. He's literally saying, when we start to educating ourselves, character-wise, morally, just as much as we do intellectually, he's already talking about the need for emotional education. Then we will be able to change our moral compass and our moral stuffing just as easily as we take care of plants and help them grow. This was back in the 1850s, right? Visionary stuff saying we need to educate ourselves in all kinds of ways, but more importantly, not just intellectually, but in ways that let us grow morally and emotionally to reach that satisfaction. So, as we study the immortality of the soul, and we have a greater understanding of the spiritual world, we will begin to realize the importance of knowing oneself and to constantly develop ourselves, which means educating ourselves both intellectually and emotionally, especially having the certainty eventually that life goes on past the physical body so that we then don't get trapped and the illusions of the physical life. That may lead us to believe that our pains are so big, because that's all we can see, that we should exit this physical world. Right? When we begin to take this knowledge in, the spiritual knowledge, something beautiful happens, and I think that I'm reminded of a beautiful story of Lazarus in the New Testament. You might remember that. Lazarus was a friend of folks, and he passed away, and Jesus then received his notice that he has passed away, and he's a couple of days away walking. People come tell him, because Lazarus was really well liked by people, and Jesus says, we'll go to him, but not yet. People are probably, what? Right? Eventually, he goes, and 4 days later, Lazarus has been dead, right? He gets there, and Lazarus' sister, Martha, there's Martha and Mary, two of the sisters, comes to Jesus and says, I believe in everything that you have told me about spiritual life. So I know that Lazarus will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. I believe that Lazarus will live on. I believe that Lazarus is not his physical body. Right? And Jesus goes back and says, I am the resurrection and the life, not Jesus himself. His teachings that he personified. The things that he tells us from the spiritual world are the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, because he's personalizing those teachings, because we need somebody to believe in. We need a guru sometimes, right? Those who believe in these teachings of the spiritual realm will live, even though they die. So even if you lose your physical body, you still live, if you're aware of all this stuff. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. He says again differently. If you believe in all the spiritual world, you will never die, because you already know that life goes on. And then he does a wonderful thing that educators do, especially the greatest educator of all time. He says, do you believe this? He turns it over to us. And he says, is there space in your heart and in your minds for this concept? Are you ready to embrace this? If so, how will you behave differently? He puts that on us. It is a question that transcends the ages and that invites us to reflect. Is there space in our lives for the knowledge of the spiritual? Because if there isn't, then it's quite possible that we might still struggle with pain and suffering that comes from attaching to impermanent things. But if there is already a small space in our souls for the certainty that life goes on, because we have seen proof, both from an intellectual perspective, but we also feel it, then we have taken immense steps to understand that life does not end with the death of the physical body. So we must necessarily tell others who might be struggling with suffering now that this is all temporary, that there will be a solution, but there will be a solution because we've seen these other things, and that suicide is really not the end of suffering. It could actually increase it. So we want to tell people that life transcends the physical life, that indeed we have so much love and help that we don't see in the world that will get us over that hump. I might have shared that with you before, but if we think about the love of God for us and the concept of reincarnation, it ought to blow our minds away. Imagine the person you love the most in this life, whoever it may be. Maybe it's your mom, your dad, your husband, wife, kids, parrot, dog, cat. Now, imagine that you've had many lives before, and in every one of your lives you had at least one of those people who were not the same person in your life today. You might have overlapped with some, but you don't always overlap with people. They love you still, just like as you love them. Just because those we care about die doesn't mean we stop loving them, do they? Do we? So why do we think that they will stop loving us? So they're still loving us. We might not see them, we might not remember them, But that is a huge quantity of people who are loving us from the other side of life and who are cheering us on. And if you think that there's more than one per life, 5, 6, you would do the math. How many people are caring for and cheering you on as we speak, even in our darkest moments when we think that we're all alone and life has no solution? Let's not swim against the tide. Swim with love. Open yourself up to the fact that you're loved beyond your belief, beyond your ability to comprehend. And that even in the darkest moments when you feel like you're struggling, that things might be overwhelming, there is so much love for you. Talk to somebody about it. Open your heart. Ask for help. And if somebody comes to you and you feel that they are struggling, ask them whether they are thinking about taking their own life. Because many times they tell us that they want to talk about it, but the lack of our emotional education prevents us. But when somebody broaches the topic, they feel like they can talk about it. We're too important for each other to let that opportunity pass. We cannot lose another soul to this great epidemic of hopelessness. Don't let that happen around you. Talk about your feelings. Talk to people. Remind them of your love for them, of God's love for us, and the love that we have all around. And of all the things that point to the fact that the soul lives on after the body. And if we can raise that doubt to ourselves and to others, maybe we can do a favor to ourselves and others and remind them that suicide is not a good answer for the problems at hand. So I hope from the bottom of my heart that you may continue to feel the joy that it is to be alive and remind yourself of the love that exists in the universe for you. Because that love will only continue to increase. Just as you had many incarnations behind you, with bonds that you have made that cannot be broken, so will you have many incarnations ahead of you, where you will continue to enlarge this concept of a universal family. Look around, you are making it as we speak. You're spending time together and caring for each other. You are adding at least this number of people to the roll of people who love you and care for you in this lifetime. So your circle of life will be always expanding, as will be your circle of love. Take that with you. Never forget. Inscribe that in your heart and your conscience, and make space for the great question that the Christ has whispered to us thousands of years ago. Do you believe this? Not just believing as in accepting it, but does it resonate in your heart that you're an immortal spirit and that everything's going to be okay? I hope so. And I hope that you continue your journey and take joy into the world, because each one of you brings immense joy to all of us, even when we don't notice it, that we're bringing joy to others. So from the bottom of my heart, keep going. Remember that you're loved, and let's all commit together to taking care of each other and making sure that we don't lose another person to the false idea that life ends with a physical body. Thank you.